White cop laughs at black woman in court until she walks up as the judge. There are moments in life when one person's laughter can cut through the air like a blade, sharp, dismissive, and fueled by prejudice. Officer Logan Barnes never expected the object of his scorn to rise above the smirks and humiliations. But sometimes fate has a twisted sense of humor of its own. When Jasmine Carter stepped into the courtroom that morning, no one realized the layers of history and heartbreak she carried within her. The cop's mocking grin betrayed a darkness he'd carefully cultivated. Yet as the gavel struck and the robes came on, the tables would turn in ways no one could have foreseen. Officer Logan Barnes prided himself on a cynical, unflinching approach to life. The buzzing neon light outside the precinct, the incessant crackle of the police radio, and the undercurrent of tension in his daily interactions. They were all just white noise to him. After almost a decade in uniform, he thought he'd seen it all. Petty theft, domestic disputes, drug busts, and the occasional high-speed chase. The uniform gave him a sense of power, one he wielded with a commanding presence, or so he believed. What truly fueled Barnes was the feeling that he stood separate from and above the people he was sworn to serve. He concealed his biases beneath coded remarks and carefully guarded expressions. Many nights he'd huddle with a couple of his trusted colleagues in a corner booth at a nearby sports bar, letting a few rough jokes slip about the communities they patrolled, especially the predominantly black neighborhoods. It was a poison, slow and corrosive, but it never fully revealed itself under fluorescent lights or official statements. People around him sensed something was off. A rookie officer had once remarked that Barnes's approach to traffic stops in certain areas seemed to involve an extra layer of intimidation. Another officer had discreetly filed a complaint after overhearing a racially charged comment. Yet somehow, official repercussions never stuck. He had a knack for navigating the rules, skirting on the edge of official misconduct, but never crossing a line that guaranteed departmental action. His record stayed squeaky clean on paper. Far across the city, Jasmine Carter was finishing her final notes for the week at her modest home office in Atlanta's Midtown, a place not too far from the towering presence of the Fulton County Courthouse, where she had recently been appointed as one of the youngest judges to ever serve in its esteemed halls. The city bustled outside her window. Cars honked, streetlights buzzed to life, and the sidewalks teemed with students, professionals, and people simply chasing their dreams. Jasmine had grown up in a tight-knit family. Her parents, both educators, instilled in her a belief in justice and fairness from a young age. From the moment she could read, her father told her about heroes of civil rights, about how the law could be a scalpel to remove injustice or a sledgehammer to maintain oppression. It was all in how those laws were interpreted and applied. She couldn't have known then that her path would lead her to the bench, wearing a judge's robe and wielding the kind of power that shapes destinies. She felt the weight of her responsibility every day and carried it with humility and steel in equal measure. Early in her career as a defense attorney, Jasmine had locked horns with more than a few tough prosecutors and stubborn police officers. She learned to spot subtle biases, how they creeped into procedure, and how they could warp an entire case. Her success and growing reputation had led to her appointment as a judge. But the road had been peppered with difficulty. Late nights hunched over law books, emotional battles representing underprivileged clients, and standing firm against prejudices that tried to cloak themselves in procedure. For every client whose life she managed to improve, there was another whose struggle weighed on her heart. Officer Barnes and Jasmine Carter had never met face to face. Not yet. But their destinies were inching closer, like opposing forces drawn by the magnet of fate. On a quiet Tuesday, Barnes received a summons to appear at Fulton County Courthouse to testify in a case. He skimmed the paperwork, a routine hearing for a disorderly conduct charge that he had filed against a combative suspect at a traffic stop. He rolled his eyes, recalling the arrest. He insisted to himself that he was just doing his job, that any roughness he used was justified by the suspect's aggression. That's how he always rationalized it. What he didn't realize was that the presiding judge had been changed at the last minute. The Honorable Judge Baxter had fallen ill, handing the case to a newly appointed judge, one with a firm hand, a wise mind, and a personal understanding of discrimination that cut deep. That judge was Jasmine Carter. Jasmine Carter's day began with a sense of anticipation. She buttoned her robe, adjusting it carefully, feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. Although she had presided over a handful of hearings already, each one felt new and electrifying. She still remembered the faces of her proud mother and father when she had been sworn in weeks earlier. Even when she locked eyes with the cynical stares of some lawyers who doubted her capability, she met them with a steady gaze. That unwavering confidence was something she had cultivated over the years in law school, in the DA's office, and in the trenches as a public defender. She left her chamber, walked through the hall, and glimpsed the nameplate outside the courtroom, Judge Jasmine Carter. The letters were etched in a gold tone that caught the overhead lights. It was a symbol of everything she'd strived for, and she said a quick silent prayer for wisdom and fairness. Meanwhile, Officer Logan Barnes arrived at the courthouse early, wearing his uniform with crisp pride. He had testified in countless cases, typically maintaining an air of cool authority. He carried thick files in his arms, standard police reports with the departmental letterhead. He greeted the bailiffs with casual nods, though they eyed him without particular warmth. Barnes was no stranger to subtle tension. Walking into the waiting area, he spotted the defendant from the arrest and the defendant's attorney. A young man with short dreadlocks and a look of fiery determination in his eyes. Barnes smirked. He knew this type. Idealistic, fresh out of law school, thinking they could outsmart a seasoned officer with a decade of street experience. He suppressed a cynical chuckle as he sat down on a bench, flipping through his notes. The courthouse halls were gradually filling with people. Some had traffic tickets, some faced serious charges, while others were there to support family members. The thick hush that always enveloped a courthouse loomed overhead, punctuated by anxious whispers and the occasional rustle of papers. That morning, Jasmine finalized her review of the docket. Hers was a busy schedule, a few misdemeanor hearings, a civil dispute or two, and the disorderly conduct hearing for which Officer Barnes would testify. As she read the case details, she recognized the pattern. A minor traffic stop in a predominantly black neighborhood had escalated into a disorderly conduct charge and resisting arrest citation. The claims from the defendant's side suggested the officer used excessive force and overreacted to a verbal protest. Jasmine felt a twinge of empathy. In her early years, she had handled similar cases from the defense side. The narratives were often the same. A small violation turned into a volatile confrontation, leaving community members feeling targeted and powerless. On the other side, law enforcement insisted they had followed protocol. She knew that not every claim of police misconduct was true, but she also knew that systemic bias was a very real phenomenon, something she had witnessed too often to dismiss. She resolved to hear the case with impartiality, but also with discernment, ready to peel back any layers of prejudice if they arose. When the bailiff announced her arrival, everyone in the courtroom stood. Jasmine walked in with measured grace, her eyes scanning the room. She observed each face, the defendant, the defense attorney, the quiet onlookers in the gallery, and finally, Officer Barnes, who stared at her with a faint, mocking grin. He sized her up quickly, young, black, female, presumably inexperienced. She could almost read the flicker of condescension in his eyes. That alone wasn't unusual. She had faced it before. But something in his posture radiated an extra layer of smugness. He carried himself like a man who believed the system was in his pocket. And then it happened. A stifled laugh escaped from his lips. Maybe it was nerves, maybe it was arrogance, or maybe it was that well of prejudice lurking under his disciplined facade. Whatever the reason, Jasmine heard it as clearly as the ticking of the courtroom clock. A hush fell across the space, and a few people darted glances at each other, unsure of how the judge would react. Jasmine did not flinch. Her eyes caught Barnes's for a brief moment. She saw the slightest ripple of discomfort in him, as if he suddenly understood that he might have stepped out of line. Yet he didn't look away, nor did he offer any apology. Without addressing the laugh directly, Jasmine began the proceedings. She introduced the case, read out the charges, and asked if the defense and prosecution were prepared to proceed. The formalities rolled on, and from time to time Officer Barnes locked eyes with her, a faint smirk still hovering around the corners of his mouth. She ignored it for the moment, focusing on the legal procedures. Later that day, when the brief hearing for the disorderly conduct case concluded, Jasmine scheduled the next session to examine evidence and testimonies in detail. She maintained her composure flawlessly during the proceeding, never once allowing Officer Barnes's silent taunts to derail her focus. Yet once she returned to her chambers, the tension she had been holding in her shoulders seemed to cascade down her spine. She sat at her desk, breathing in and out, letting the moment pass. A cup of herbal tea sat untouched beside a stack of case files, its steam long gone. She moved the tea aside and leaned forward on her elbows, steepling her fingers in reflection. The echo of that quiet laugh lingered in her mind, how it had carried an unspoken message, a dismissal of her authority. In her private thoughts, Jasmine journeyed back to her early days in law school at Emory University. She was often one of the few black women in large lecture halls. The stares, the small slights, the assumptions about her capabilities, they created a silent weight. The heartbreak came from watching other bright minds, people of color, drop out or lose confidence under the same unrelenting pressure. Jasmine had refused to be crushed. She remembered the late nights in the library, working twice as hard to prove she belonged. Those memories fueled her commitment to serve on the bench with fairness and empathy. Outside her chambers, the courthouse halls had mostly emptied for the day. A janitor's cart rattled along the floor, and the security personnel yawned behind the metal detectors. But in a conference room down the corridor, Officer Barnes was having a conversation with the district attorney's team regarding upcoming testimonies. He wore a smug expression, leaning back in his chair as he recounted the arrest in question. He made it sound routine. Suspect was uncooperative, had to use minimal force. Suspect claimed racial bias. Same old story. One of the junior DAs, a Latina woman named Marisol Pena, listened intently. She glanced at Barnes's record. It was eerily spotless for an officer who worked in high-crime areas. No complaints that stuck. Yet there was a pattern of arrestees consistently accusing him of racially charged language and excessive force. Pena was newly assigned to this case, so she tried to maintain neutrality, but a concern flickered in her mind. Was there more beneath the surface? "Officer Barnes," she asked, "how did the traffic stop escalate? Did the suspect become physical?" Barnes shrugged, a little too nonchalant. He was shouting, swearing. "I told him to step out of the car. He resisted, so I had to cuff him. It's all in my report." Marisol nodded, not entirely convinced. She'd read the defendant's statement. It alleged that Barnes had verbally provoked him, using disparaging remarks. The other officers who arrived on scene after the suspect was already in custody gave a half-hearted confirmation that the suspect was agitated, yet none corroborated any actual violence on the suspect's part. Barnes tapped his fingers on the table, his impatience showing. "Look, I've done this 100 times. The suspect's just trying to play the victim. Happens all the time." Marisol locked eyes with him for a moment, her gaze probing. "We'll do our due diligence, officer. We need to be prepared for anything in front of Judge Carter." Barnes snorted a laugh. Judge Carter. Right. He didn't say more, but his dismissive tone spoke volumes. Leaving the meeting, he strolled back through the courthouse, nodding a curt goodbye to the security guard at the exit. Once outside, he allowed himself a moment to bask in the warm Atlanta air. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. He couldn't suppress a smirk, remembering the fluster he thought he had seen in Jasmine Carter's eyes. He assumed he had the upper hand. After all, how many judges really went against a veteran cop's testimony? In his experience, once he donned that uniform and pinned on that badge, the world treated him differently. The color of authority overshadowed any suspicion about his personal biases, or so he believed. But seeds of discontent were sowing themselves across this case, among the defense, the DA's office, and even the staff who had witnessed that small moment of disrespect in the courtroom. Word spread quietly. "Did you see how that officer laughed at the new judge?" People whispered, speculated. Could it have been an innocent reaction? Or was there something deeper at play? As the sun sank below the skyline, Jasmine finally gathered her things to leave the courthouse. The day had taken more out of her than she anticipated. While locking her chamber's door, she ran into Marisol Pena in the hallway. "Judge Carter," Marisol greeted politely. "Good evening. Looking forward to presenting the case soon." Jasmine smiled, relieved to encounter a friendly face. "Likewise, Miss Pena. I'm eager to hear all sides and ensure we handle things properly." Marisol hesitated briefly as if weighing her words. "Yes, well, I just wanted you to know I respect your position, and I'm sure we'll have a fair hearing." Her tone carried a hint of something unspoken, perhaps a subtle encouragement or acknowledgement that there could be friction ahead. Jasmine noticed the flicker in Marisol's eyes, the slightest tension. She simply nodded. "I appreciate that. Let's both do our best for justice." They parted ways, each understanding that the upcoming court sessions would be more than just a matter of facts. Beneath the surface, there was a current of mistrust and potential bigotry that could taint the proceedings. And at the center of this swirling storm stood two individuals from vastly different walks of life, circling each other like opposing forces drawn inevitably toward conflict. 2 days before the detailed hearing, the hum of tension around the courthouse grew louder. Clerks exchanged knowing looks, security guards whispered rumors, and attorneys quietly speculated on whether this case would be routine or something more. There was an undercurrent that no one could quite define, but everyone felt it. That morning, Jasmine Carter woke up earlier than usual. She slipped into running shoes and took a jog around her neighborhood. Physical activity helped her clear her mind. The crisp air of dawn carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant aroma of coffee from a local cafe. Each step loosened the knot of anxiety in her chest. She replayed the upcoming hearing in her mind. Her primary duty to remain fair, unbiased, and guided solely by the law. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this case symbolized something bigger. A microcosm of racial tensions and policing concerns that had been simmering in the city for a long time. She couldn't let her personal experiences overshadow her judgment, but she also couldn't ignore them. By the time she returned home, beads of sweat glistened on her forehead, and the weight of the day felt a bit more manageable. Meanwhile, in a stark contrast, Officer Logan Barnes began his day with a stiff black coffee and a sense of assuredness. He had an informal meeting with his union rep that morning, just to go over protocol. The rep, a middle-aged man named Doug Sorensen, had a calm demeanor and decades of experience navigating departmental politics. "I've seen the chatter, Logan," Sorensen said, folding his arms across his chest. "A new judge, a tricky case, potential allegations of bias. Keep it straight and narrow in that courtroom." Barnes took a swallow of his coffee. "I'm not worried, Doug. I've got the facts, the dashcam footage, it's all standard procedure." Sorensen gave him a level stare. "Just make sure you don't let any personal feelings show. This is an age where everything's under a magnifying glass. One misstep, and people will call for your badge." Barnes bristled slightly. "Yeah, I hear you." Personal feelings. The phrase lingered as Barnes walked away. He wondered if he truly harbored personal bias, or if he was just doing his job day in and day out. Deep down, he remembered the jokes and sneers he'd shared with like-minded officers, but in his mind, that was just camaraderie, blowing off steam. No harm done, right? On the other side of town, the defendant, Marcus Evans, sat with his public defender, Anthony Glenn, in a small office at the public defender's building. Marcus was a young mechanic, no serious record, just a couple of minor traffic violations. He twisted his cap nervously, recounting the events of that night yet again. Anthony listened with patience, taking notes. Marcus insisted he wasn't aggressive. He claimed Barnes pulled him over for a broken taillight, then escalated the situation with a barrage of rude comments. He said something like, "You people never learn," Marcus recalled, biting his lower lip. Then he yanked me out of the car. Anthony's expression hardened. "If that's true, we need to bring it forward. But it's your word against his, unless we can find solid evidence." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the system pressing on him. The fear that no one would believe him gnawed at his gut. He'd heard stories from neighbors, from cousins, about how the word of a cop outweighs yours. Even with the new judge, even with the chance that she might see through the uniform's veneer, he wasn't entirely hopeful. By late afternoon, an uneasiness settled like a low-hanging fog over the day's end. People involved in the case, Barnes, Marcus, Marisol, Anthony, and Jasmine, seemed to be connected by invisible threads of tension. Each had their own doubts, their own anxieties, their own sense of what justice should look like. That evening, Jasmine stayed late in her chambers to go over her notes and the available evidence. She requested the dashcam footage from the traffic stop. It arrived in a digitally sealed folder, labeled with official timestamps. She opened it, headphones in, eyes narrowed in concentration. Static flickered, then the dim street came into view. She could see the suspect's car pulling over. The volume of the audio was faint, with the crackle of the police radio. She heard Barnes's voice asking for a license and registration. Then something was muffled. Marcus's voice, perhaps. Barnes repeated his command. The footage was shaky, capturing partial glimpses of movement. Then the audio cut out intermittently. She frowned. Technical glitches, or something else? She replayed the footage multiple times. The arrest happened off-camera mostly, just at the edge of the dashcam lens. She couldn't see Barnes's exact actions, only the top half of Marcus's torso as he was pulled out of the car. The man's arms flailed. It was impossible to discern if he was resisting or simply being yanked forcefully. Jasmine took a few notes. The incomplete nature of the footage meant she would have to rely heavily on testimonies. A sense of dread welled up within her. The truth was already half obscured by technical flaws and conflicting accounts. Her role was to find the most just outcome, yet she worried that the biases, both unconscious and overt, would muddy the waters. As she closed her laptop, she noticed the time. Nearly 9 p.m. She shook her head, realizing she'd barely eaten. With a heavy sigh, she packed her files, switched off the lights in her chamber, and made her way home. The stage was set for a showdown of conflicting narratives. Hidden agendas lurked beneath official paperwork, and doubts festered among those expected to uphold the law. With every tick of the clock toward the next hearing, it felt as if an invisible force was winding the tension tighter and tighter. And when the time came to present the facts in open court, no one would walk away unscathed by the revelations that awaited. The morning of the full hearing arrived with the kind of atmosphere that promised rain. Gray clouds loomed over Atlanta's skyline, casting a subdued light across the Fulton County Courthouse. Reporters occasionally hovered around high-profile cases, but this one hadn't yet garnered major media attention, just a few local advocates interested in potential issues of police misconduct. Yet the tension inside the building was almost tangible. By 9 a.m., the courtroom filled with attorneys, the defendant, a handful of curious onlookers, and, of course, Officer Barnes. He sat beside the district attorney's table, wearing his uniform like armor. The expression on his face was carefully neutral, but a slight restlessness in his posture suggested an underlying smugness or perhaps nerves. When the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Jasmine Carter," Barnes rose along with everyone else, chin lifted. The moment Jasmine walked in, robed and dignified, a hush enveloped the room. She took her seat, laid out her notes, and surveyed the assembly. Her gaze fell momentarily on Barnes, who looked right back at her. She wondered if he remembered the dismissive laugh or if he was still harboring that subtle disdain behind a blank face, a flicker of something in his eyes, Was it defiance? She couldn't be sure. With the usual procedural formalities addressed, the hearing began in earnest. The prosecuting side led with Officer Barnes's testimony. He recounted the events of the night in question, describing Marcus Evans as belligerent and non-compliant. He painted a picture of a suspect who nearly lunged at him, forcing him to use measured force to subdue the threat. Marcus sat at the defense table, his shoulders tense. Anthony Glenn took notes frantically, preparing to cross-examine. When it was time for the defense to question Barnes, Anthony approached the stand, his voice steady but determined. "Officer Barnes, you said you instructed my client to step out of the vehicle. At which point did he become physically aggressive?" Barnes shrugged, affecting a casual stance. "Immediately after I asked him, he started shouting at me, refused to comply, and tried to push me away." Anthony nodded. "And this pushing, was it captured clearly on your dash cam?" Barnes cleared his throat. "Not clearly. We were at the edge of the frame, so the footage doesn't show every detail." "And your body camera?" Anthony pressed. Barnes hesitated. I turned on my body camera, but it malfunctioned. No usable footage came from it." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Faulty body cams had become a point of contention in many police misconduct cases. Jasmine kept her expression neutral, though she felt a pang of dismay. Anthony's tone sharpened slightly. "It malfunctioned. That's unfortunate. But you're certain my client used physical force against you?" "Yes," Barnes replied tersely. "Yet you filed no charges for assaulting an officer, only disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Why not assault on a police officer if he truly tried to push you?" Barnes's jaw tightened. "Given the circumstances, I believe the lesser charges were sufficient. I'm not a monster. I don't throw the book at every suspect." Another wave of whispered reactions rustled among the spectators. Jasmine glanced around, ensuring order. Anthony's final question came like a quiet challenge. "Officer, did you at any point use any derogatory language or slurs toward my client?" Barnes stiffened. "Absolutely not." "Did you say, 'You people never learn'?" Anthony asked, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. Barnes let a brief sneer slip across his lips, something that only a few attentive eyes caught. "I have no recollection of saying that." Anthony thanked him and returned to his seat. Tension hung thick in the air. The defendant, Marcus, took the stand next, voice trembling as he recounted the traffic stop. He insisted he complied with Barnes's commands until Barnes started using aggressive language. Marcus testified that the push was Barnes's doing, pulling him out of the car abruptly, causing him to flail in self-defense. As he spoke, Jasmine watched Barnes. She saw the faint rolling of his eyes, the subtle curling of his lip. He was not overtly theatrical, but the scorn in his body language was undeniable. She made a mental note of it. Then came the final piece of potential evidence, a cell phone video from a bystander who witnessed part of the arrest. The video, shaky and grainy, showed Marcus standing outside his car, arms raised slightly, and Barnes moving in swiftly. The angle made it hard to see who initiated contact first, but it did reveal Barnes shoving Marcus against the hood with force. A wave of murmurs swept the gallery. Officer Barnes's face reddened ever so slightly, but he maintained his composure. In cross-examination, he insisted that angle didn't show Marcus lunging a moment earlier. By the end of the hearing, the lines were sharply drawn. The prosecution leaned on Barnes's record and official paperwork, while the defense highlighted inconsistencies and the suspicious lack of body cam footage. Jasmine adjourned the session, declaring that she would take time to review all evidence thoroughly before rendering a decision. The final hearing was scheduled on a day when the sky teetered between sun and storm clouds, as though the weather itself couldn't decide which fate to cast over Atlanta. The courtroom was fuller than before, with a few community activists and local reporters in attendance, sensing the potential for a significant ruling on police conduct. Jasmine Carter presided with an aura of poise and gravity. She reminded herself to keep personal feelings in check. As the proceedings commenced, Anthony Glenn presented a motion to call the new witness, Rosa Thompson, to the stand. Marisol Peña did not object, and Judge Carter allowed the testimony. Rosa, visibly nervous, took the oath. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her purse tightly on her lap. Anthony guided her gently through her account. She recounted stepping outside her store to throw out trash bags, hearing an altercation, and witnessing the officer forcibly pinning the driver against the hood. Her voice was steady enough as she described Marcus's body language. He seemed shocked, not like he was trying to fight, more like he was trying to protect himself from being hurt. Anthony glanced at the jurors. Though this was a bench trial, some junior interns and court staff listened intently, as if they were an informal jury, and then at Judge Carter. He asked Rosa, "Did you hear any remarks or slurs from the officer?" She hesitated. "Not clearly, but I did hear the officer say something like, 'You people don't know when to stop talking,' or something along those lines." A low rumble of conversation spread through the spectators. Officer Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marisol stood up for cross-examination. She calmly but firmly asked, "Miss Thompson, how far away were you when you overheard this? Could you be mistaken about what you heard?" Rosa admitted she was about 20 feet away. It was dark, and the exact wording might be fuzzy. But she was certain the officer made a generalizing statement referencing "you people." Marisol probed further, but Rosa's account remained consistent. There was no direct slur, but the phrase implied a disparaging attitude. When Barnes was called back for rebuttal, he looked uneasy. He denied ever saying such words, calling Rosa's testimony hearsay and a misunderstanding. Yet, his usual composure cracked under Anthony's pointed questions. Anthony concluded his questioning with a simple but potent statement. "Officer Barnes, we have dashcam footage, a bystander's cell phone video, and now a witness statement that contradict your official report. You claim your body camera failed. Do you have anything else to say to reconcile these inconsistencies?" Barnes glared. "I enforce the law. Sometimes people get upset. That doesn't make me racist, and it doesn't mean I used excessive force." Jasmine observed him carefully. She saw the tightness of his jaw, the defiance in his gaze. Something in her heart lurched. She thought of all the times she'd encountered authority figures who believed they were untouchable. But she also remembered her judicial oath. She'd need to weigh all evidence carefully. By late afternoon, the arguments had been laid bare. Marisol and Anthony gave their closing statements. Marisol focused on the officer's prior commendations, the possibility that Marcus's actions were more aggressive than they appeared, and the lack of conclusive evidence of any slur. Anthony emphasized the consistent pattern of Barnes's alleged behavior, the suspiciously malfunctioning body cam, and Rosa's testimony that Barnes used a phrase indicating bias. When both sides rested, Jasmine called for a brief recess before delivering her judgment. She retreated to her chambers, her mind swirling with facts, testimonies, and her own moral code. She couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that Barnes escalated the situation unnecessarily and possibly used racially charged language. The video and witness accounts strongly suggested that Marcus was not the aggressor. Yet she also knew that a judge's ruling must be based on the legal standards for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Did Barnes have probable cause? Did Marcus truly resist arrest? Had the officer used excessive force? She sat at her desk, elbows resting on the polished wood, head in her hands. The noise of the world outside seemed muffled. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the burden of her position. Lives could be changed by her ruling. The tension weighed heavily, a swirl of reason and empathy clashing in her mind. Eventually, she emerged from her chambers, robes flowing behind her like a solemn black tide. The courtroom fell silent as she took her seat. With a measured breath, she began. "Having reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the relevant statutes, I find that the charges against Mr. Marcus Evans are not substantiated by sufficient evidence." She went on to detail the reasons for her decision, outlining the inconsistencies in Barnes's testimony, the conflicting evidence that suggested Evans did not pose a threat, and the suspicious pattern of camera failures. Therefore, she concluded, the court dismisses the charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest against Mr. Evans. Word of Judge Carter's ruling spread quickly through local news and social media. Headlines hinted at potential police misconduct, charges dismissed amid racial bias allegations, judge recommends internal affairs probe, and Atlanta courtroom shakeup leaves officer in hot seat. Barnes felt the backlash almost immediately. Within a day, Internal Affairs launched a preliminary review of his past cases. His superiors, who had previously brushed off minor complaints, suddenly eyed him with scrutiny. The union rep, Doug Sorensen, tried to reassure him, but the rising public interest made everything more complicated. Talk radio hosts debated whether Judge Carter's recommendation was overreaching or necessary. Community activists applauded her courage, while pro-police groups accused her of vilifying a dedicated officer. Social media was awash with heated arguments. Barnes's face, once a token representation of law and order, became a flashpoint of controversy. For Jasmine, the days following the ruling were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. She had upheld the law as she saw fit, but she was not naive. She knew the personal attacks were coming. Sure enough, hateful emails landed in her inbox. Anonymous callers left voicemails spewing venom, calling her unfit, biased, or worse. Yet for every hateful message, there were 2 or 3 grateful ones. Messages from ordinary people saying, "Thank you for giving us hope," or, "At last, someone who sees us." Despite the stress, Jasmine found solace in these signs that her ruling touched a chord in a community long weary of feeling unheard. Meanwhile, Marcus tried to go back to normal life. He returned to his job as a mechanic, but found reporters occasionally waiting for him outside the garage, seeking interviews. He politely declined, wanting nothing more than to fix engines and move on. His family, however, encouraged him to speak publicly. This might help others who've been through the same, they argued. Torn between a desire for privacy and a sense of responsibility, Marcus remained on the fence. Officer Barnes, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated at the station. Some colleagues still backed him up, officers who believed wholeheartedly in the blue code of loyalty. Others kept their distance, not wanting to get dragged into the controversy. His friend Tim tried to lend an ear, but even Tim suggested, "Maybe take a step back, Logan. Let this blow over." Blow over. The words echoed in Barnes's mind, fueling his resentment. He didn't see himself as a villain, yet the world was painting him that way. Each morning he woke up to more articles, more online debates, more commentary on what had happened in that courtroom. He found himself replaying the hearing, the witnesses, and especially Judge Carter's poised demeanor. Her face was etched into his thoughts. That quiet authority had cast a shadow over him, exposing something he never thought would see daylight. At a mandatory meeting with Internal Affairs, the lead investigator, Captain Marion Fields, asked Barnes direct questions about the night in question and his overall conduct. Her eyes showed little sympathy. "Officer Barnes, can you explain the repeated malfunctions of your body camera in multiple incidents?" she asked, flipping through a file. "It's quite a pattern." He felt sweat prickling his forehead. "The equipment's faulty at times. It happens." "Has it been reported for maintenance?" He shifted in his seat. "I guess I forgot to file some forms." "Uh-huh," Captain Fields responded, unimpressed. "We'll be reviewing all relevant footage, or lack thereof. Also, we're going to interview the other officers who've been on calls with you." The meeting ended with Barnes feeling cornered. Guilt, anger, and fear churned inside him. He drove home in silence, battling the tornado of emotions swirling around his mind. That night, as thunderclouds again gathered in the summer sky, he sat alone in his darkened apartment, the hum of the overhead fan filling the void. He scrolled through his phone, checking messages. Most were from fellow officers urging him to hang in there. A few were from unknown numbers hurling insults and threats. He paused at one message from an old friend who'd moved to another state years ago, It read, "Logan, I saw the news. Maybe it's time to ask yourself some hard questions. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." The words rattled him. Did he need to confront truths about himself that he'd been avoiding? The idea was unsettling. And so the backlash grew, not just in the public arena, but in the inner sanctums of Barnes's conscience. For Jasmine Carter, it confirmed what she already knew. Standing for justice often comes with a price. For the city, it was a moment to pause and consider whether the tides of accountability might be changing. And for Barnes, it was a reckoning that would either break him or force him to become something different, if he was brave enough to face the truth. A week later, the tension showed no signs of abating. Television crews and freelance reporters hovered outside the Fulton County Courthouse, hoping to grab a statement from Judge Carter. She slipped in and out through side entrances, trying to dodge the media frenzy. She didn't want the spotlight. She wanted to perform her duties without being dragged into public spectacle. However, the courthouse hallways whispered a different story. Some judges quietly admired her fortitude. Others grumbled that she was stirring up trouble, that she should have simply ruled on the case and left it at that. One morning, as Jasmine was collecting her mail at the courthouse, she encountered Judge Samantha Wilcox, an older colleague who had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades. Wilcox pursed her lips and approached Jasmine, looking somewhat disapproving. "Jasmine," Wilcox said, her voice low, "I respect your passion, but you're drawing a lot of heat on this place." Jasmine squared her shoulders. "I applied the law, Judge Wilcox. The officer's testimony was inconsistent, and I felt obligated to recommend further review." Wilcox sighed, shaking her head. "Yes, well, you're still new here. You'll learn there are ways to handle these matters more discreetly." She turned and walked away, leaving Jasmine with a swirl of mixed emotions, frustration, hurt, and a steadfast resolve. Meanwhile, the internal affairs investigation into Barnes's past cases accelerated. Old arrest reports were dusted off and witnesses were contacted. To Barnes's dismay, a few more people came forward claiming that he had used excessive force or made offhand discriminatory remarks during arrests. These accounts, once brushed under the carpet, gained renewed attention under the media spotlight. At the station, Barnes felt eyes on him wherever he went. Even routine tasks, like getting a coffee or typing up a report, were charged with an undercurrent of tension. The well of confidence he once drank from now seemed to have run dry. During one particularly draining shift, he found himself driving through a quiet neighborhood, lights off, aimlessly patrolling the streets. He ended up near the location where he had pulled over Marcus Evans. The memory flooded back. The adrenaline, the anger he felt, the dismissive laugh he'd carried into the courtroom, convinced of his own righteousness. He killed the engine and sat there, the silence pressing against his ears. A weight sank in his chest. He remembered his old friend's text, the one asking if he was ready to face some hard questions. Did he cross lines he never admitted to himself? A tap on the window startled him. A concerned resident asked if he needed help. He quickly waved them off, feeling embarrassed. Turning the key in the ignition, he drove away, the question gnawing at him. That same evening, Jasmine found some respite at her parents' home. She joined them for dinner, seeking the warm comfort of familiar faces. Her mother made homemade cornbread and chili, a nostalgic meal that pulled her back to childhood. They ate in relative quiet until her father cleared his throat. "You've been in the headlines, baby girl," he said gently. "Tough times?" Jasmine sighed, setting her spoon down. "I knew being a judge would come with scrutiny, but this is more intense than I expected. I just did what I believed was right." Her mother reached out and squeezed her hand. "We're proud of you. Not everyone has the courage to rock the boat when needed." Her father nodded. "Remember, real change happens when good people hold the line. You might face backlash, but the arc of the moral universe is long. It bends toward justice, but only if people stand firm." Tears threatened to well in Jasmine's eyes, but she blinked them away. She found renewed strength in her parents' support, a sense of calm settling in her heart, at least for the moment. Back at the station, Barnes discovered that he had been put on administrative leave pending the outcome of the internal affairs investigation. No uniform, no patrol car, no gun, just a waiting game that felt like a slow-motion freefall. He walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box of personal items from his desk. Photos with colleagues, a stack of citations he'd received over the years, a half-empty bag of coffee beans, remnants of a life he felt slipping through his fingers. Outside, Tim stood waiting. The older officer put a hand on Barnes's shoulder and said, "We'll get through this, just keep it together." But Barnes's mind drifted elsewhere. He thought about the moment in court when he had sneered at Judge Carter. The memory now filled him with an unsettling regret, as if he had lit the fuse of his own downfall. In the swirling chaos, the seeds planted by that single act of contempt, that single moment of racist mockery, continued to grow. A reckoning was indeed taking shape, affecting not just Barnes and Jasmine, but the entire community that watched, waited, and hoped for some measure of truth to prevail. The cost of that truth, however, was becoming clearer with each passing day, and not everyone would walk away unscathed. Days turned to weeks, and the city's conversation kept circling back to the same story. A black judge who dismissed charges against a defendant, calling out potential police misconduct, and the cop who was now under fire. Protests began popping up outside police headquarters. Some were in support of Barnes, claiming that law enforcement was under unjust attack. Others demanded broader reforms, believing Barnes's actions were only the tip of a deeper iceberg. Judge Jasmine Carter tried to tune out the noise, focusing on her other cases and responsibilities. She presided over domestic disputes, contract disagreements, and even a homicide hearing. Yet in the back of her mind, the resonance of the Barnes case lingered. She hoped that, regardless of public opinion, the internal investigation would be thorough and fair. Meanwhile, Barnes spent his days cooped up in his apartment, blinds drawn, restless. He'd once found pride in policing, a sense of purpose. Now that was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of guilt and a cloud of uncertainty. He shunned calls from reporters, gave terse replies to colleagues, and avoided social media. Eventually, he succumbed to the swirl of doubts in his head and reached out to that old friend who had offered a listening ear. His name was Caleb Watson. They had gone through the police academy together before Caleb moved to another department out west. Over a scratchy phone line, Barnes admitted he felt cornered. "It's like my life is collapsing," Barnes said, voice tight with emotion he usually kept hidden. Did I go too far?" Caleb's tone was gentle but unwavering. "Logan, we've all had tough stops, but some of the stuff I read about your cases, it's not normal, man. Maybe it's time to do some soul searching." Barnes bristled. "I'm not a racist," he snapped. I don't tolerate attitude on the streets." "People have attitudes, Logan, but you're the one with the badge. The power dynamic is different," Caleb explained. "I've seen how easy it is to cross lines without even realizing it. If you can't see that, you're never going to break the cycle." Silence stretched between them. Barnes finally whispered, "Maybe you're right." The next day, compelled by some new stirring in his conscience, Barnes decided to seek out Marcus Evans. He found a phone number on an old report, dialed it, and was surprised when Marcus picked up. The brief call led to an agreement to meet at a nearby coffee shop, neutral ground. When Barnes arrived, he was out of uniform, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, feeling strangely vulnerable without the badge. Marcus, cautious, was already there, sitting at a corner table. He tensed when he saw Barnes approach. They stared at each other for a moment, an awkward tension in the air. "Thanks for meeting me," Barnes said, his tone hesitant. Marcus folded his arms. "Why did you want to meet?" Barnes sat down, exhaling slowly. "I don't really know. Maybe to apologize. I think I messed up. I was so wrapped up in being in control. I got used to the idea that I could treat people however I wanted if I believed they were in the wrong." Marcus's eyes flickered with anger and lingering hurt. "You did treat me like garbage, shoved me, mocked me, You put me in jail for a night. My record still has that arrest on it. Barnes nodded, swallowing hard. I'm sorry, he finally said. I don't know if it means anything now, but I am. I can't change what happened. I'm trying to figure out where I lost my way. Marcus looked at him, studying his expression. I didn't expect this. I figured you'd stay behind your blue wall. They talked, haltingly, for nearly an hour. Barnes admitted to the toxic culture he sometimes participated in, the jokes, the subtle prejudices he'd turned into normal banter. Marcus explained how humiliating and terrifying the arrest had been, how powerless he felt. By the end, there was no grand reconciliation, no handshake that erased the past, but there was a quiet moment of understanding, a sliver of humanity between them. Marcus stood up to leave, pausing to say, It's up to you to fix yourself. Nobody else can do that for you. Barnes nodded, too choked up to reply. He watched Marcus walk away, the doorbell chiming as the coffee shop door swung shut. By the end of the month, Internal Affairs concluded its investigation. The findings were damning for Barnes. They documented multiple instances in which his body camera had mysteriously malfunctioned, patterns of aggressive behavior that weren't fully justified, and concerning racial complaints that, while never fully substantiated before, painted a consistent picture. The final recommendation: terminate Officer Logan Barnes from the force. The official statement cited conduct unbecoming of an officer, repeated negligence in maintaining required equipment, and a pattern of bias-related complaints. Barnes received the news on a Friday afternoon via a terse phone call from Captain Fields. He thought he had mentally prepared for the worst, but the confirmation hit like a sledgehammer. His career, the identity he had built around wearing the badge, came crashing down in a single sentence. Walking out of the station for the last time, he saw pity in some eyes, relief in others, and outright disdain in a few. The very institution he once revered had turned its back on him, or so he felt. In truth, he had cast the first stone, but only now did the weight of his own actions bear down on him. News of his termination spread quickly. Online commentators were split. Some claimed it was an overdue step toward accountability. Others argued it was a scapegoat scenario for a flawed system. Barnes tried to avoid the spotlight, but the echo of his downfall followed him, dogged him, became a label he couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Judge Jasmine Carter went about her judicial duties, aware of Barnes's fate. She was not celebratory. Justice to her meant fairness and improvement, not merely punishment. One evening she lingered in her chambers, contemplating the ripple effects of the case. While she believed that men like Barnes had to be held accountable, part of her hoped he might find a path toward redeeming himself. She wasn't naive. She knew some people never changed, but she also believed in the possibility of transformation. Marcus Evans, for his part, found an unexpected sense of empowerment in knowing that the system had, for once, supported him. He finally decided to speak briefly to a local reporter, highlighting his gratitude for Judge Carter's ruling and the crucial witness testimony that bolstered his defense. He didn't relish in Barnes's termination. Instead, he spoke of the hope that fewer people would face unjust treatment. Yet Barnes's downfall wasn't the end of his karmic trail. In the weeks after he lost his job, he discovered that job prospects for a former police officer with a record of misconduct were bleak. The label "fired for cause" loomed over any background check. He burned through his savings, growing desperate. He tried to appeal the department's decision, but with Internal Affairs' thorough report and the swirl of public opinion, his efforts fizzled. The union gave lukewarm support at best, unwilling to invest resources in a losing battle. Thank you for joining us through the sweeping journey of twisted fates and unforeseen reckonings. The story of one cop's arrogance, a courageous judge, and a determined defendant reminds us that in the grand theater of life, power and pride can topple in an instant, especially when truth stands up to face them. If there's one lesson to take away, it's that real justice isn't blind to bias. It demands confrontation, empathy, and unwavering resolve. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe people can truly change after facing their deepest flaws, or are some destined never to learn? Share your perspective in the comments below. And if this story moved you, even just a little, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating thought-provoking tales that spark reflection and conversation. Until next time, stay inspired and stay engaged.